I knew the thread count of life because I had spent 60 years bent over the fabric of it. 73 years old, and I still knew exactly how many stitches went into a proper hem, or how much sweat it took to afford a small sunny corner of the world. That corner was my condo in Fort Lauderdale. It wasn't big, but it was mine. And after decades in a humid Miami factory, owning those walls felt like freedom. But freedom tastes different when your heart is trying to beat its way out of your chest. It had been 6 months of terror. Little flutters at first, like a nervous bird caught in my ribcage. Then full-blown panic. I'd be sitting, watching my soap operas, and suddenly my heart would just take off. The doctors. Oh, the doctors. Young things in white coats, always looking rushed. They called it a complex case. They said my heart rate was hitting 170, sometimes higher even when I was just sitting quiet. They kept changing the pills, swapping the beta blockers for diuretics and back again. I just took whatever they gave me, hoping I wouldn't go to sleep and never wake up. The only thing harder than the pain was David. My boy. He was a good child, gentle, but he was putty in Clara's hands. Clara. She didn't see my condo as a place where I lived and breathed. She saw it as a number, a down payment on a new life for her and David. The minute my health started giving out, Clara started circling. "Mom, you shouldn't strain yourself," she'd chirp. She had a voice like cheap bells, too sweet and too loud. She'd come in, push me onto the sofa, and take over my little kitchen. "I'm making you David's favorite soup. It's important to rest." I always felt guilty for being a bother. I'd nod and let her fuss. But I noticed something. Every time Clara brought food, every time she insisted on staying the night, just to help out, the pain came back worse. The chest ache was deeper. That breathlessness like someone was sitting on my rib cage felt heavier. It was subtle at first, just a nagging feeling. Am I getting worse because I'm old, or because they're here? I pushed the thought away. It felt too ugly to even whisper it in my own mind. Then came Tuesday afternoon. That was the day I stopped doubting the ugliness. I was folding towels, just simple white towels, in the bedroom. Nothing strenuous. The heart attack that wouldn't stop hit me like a kick from a mule. Dizziness, blurring vision, and that terrible galloping. I swore I could hear my heart physically, rattling my ribs loose. My first cardiologist, the only one who ever looked me in the eye, had given me stern rules, so I moved. I grabbed the phone, the one I kept charged right next to the bed, and hit speed dial 911. I gasped out the address and my unit number. It was the hardest thing I'd done all year, just pulling the air into my lungs. I didn't try to lie flat. That doctor had said no. Cardiac position rule. Prop yourself up 45 degrees. I dragged myself across the shag carpet. It needed cleaning, but that was the least of my worries now, and piled the couch cushions behind me. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't even get a grip on the aspirin bottle. I skipped it. Just focus on breathing. The nurses had taught me how to breathe right. 4 counts in, hold, and 6 counts out through pursed lips. Controlled diaphragmatic breathing, they called it. I tried, but the panic was too big. It swallowed the air before it could reach my lungs. The pain sharpened, digging deep. I had one more thing to do. The last rule the ambulance driver told me. Unlock the door. I crawled. My 73-year-old knees scraped across the floor, but I reached the front door, flipped the deadbolt, and hit the hall light so they wouldn't miss the unit. The sirens were wailing somewhere down the street. That noise always sounds like desperation, even when it's for someone else. I felt the final violent spike, 192 beats per minute. A number so big, it didn't even sound like a living thing. I grabbed the little nitro bottle. I put one tablet under my tongue, just like the prescription said, begging for that familiar, blessed relief. Nothing. It did nothing. The pain didn't ease. The galloping heart kept going like a terrible clock running out of time. When the paramedics burst through the door, they found me propped up, pale, sweating. I had followed every rule. My meds were current. The door was open. I had called immediately. Everything was textbook perfect for surviving a cardiac event, except for one thing. I wasn't surviving it. At the ER, the doctors stabilized me. They poked, they prodded, they took pictures of my insides. And the young doctor, maybe 30 years old, looking exhausted himself, shook his head again. "Complex case, Mrs. Peterson. The meds just aren't taking hold. It's like your system is actively fighting the treatment." Fighting the treatment. The words hung in the air like a bad smell. I was too weak and too drugged up to care much. I just wanted the pain to stop. A few days later, I was back home, exhausted, weak, moving like I was made of chipped glass. David and Clara arrived immediately. They didn't come to hold my hand. They came to check the condition of the condo. I know they did, the way Clara's eyes lingered on the crown molding and the tiny water stain in the corner of the ceiling. They spent hours in the kitchen, pretending to clean and organize. I was lying in my bedroom, the door slightly ajar. The medication made my head swim, drifting me in and out of a sticky, heavy sleep. I could hear David's voice, low and muffled, then Clara's voice, sharp and cold. "Honestly, David, how many more close calls are we going to endure?" Clara whispered. There was such impatience in her voice, like she was waiting for a bus that was running late. "She's wasting the last of her Medicare benefits on useless ER trips. The quicker this situation resolves, the sooner we can list this place. We need the money." My eyes snapped open, but I didn't move. List this place. My place? David murmured something indistinct. He sounded worried, maybe weak, but not arguing. Then Clara's voice came again. It was hard as a coffin nail, loud and clear, and it sank into my bones, freezing me from the inside out. "Just make sure she takes the usual tonight, David. We can't let her linger. The longer she waits, the more she could change the will." The air left my lungs completely. The usual. David agreeing, my will. My life. I spent the rest of the day lying still, pretending to sleep, but my heart was doing a slow, cold drumbeat against my ribs. I tried to make sense of it. They couldn't mean what I thought they meant. They were talking about the condo, the $450,000 insurance policy. That much was clear. But David was my son. I used to tell David, money doesn't grow on trees. But now I realized he thought it grew right here, in the walls of my small condo. Clara brought the healing tea around 9 o'clock. It was dark, sweet with honey, but it always had a faint, bitter, medicinal aftertaste. Tonight that bitterness tasted like rust. "Drink up, Mom," she said, her smile wide and artificial. "It will help you rest." I took a sip. I swallowed hard. The bitterness went down. She sat there watching me until the mug was empty, talking about how beautiful the weather was, talking about her new car loan. She left the room, shutting the door softly. I lay there, waiting. I told myself to calm down. Maybe I was just overly anxious. Maybe the drugs were making me paranoid. Maybe I should just take it with a grain of salt. But 40 minutes later, the galloping started. Not the terror and panic, not the anxiety, but the physical, brutal spike, My heart rate was back up to 178 beats per minute. It was the same feeling that had sent me to the hospital, and it always happened after her tea. It hit me then, a clear, horrifying thought that cut through the drug haze and the panic. It wasn't a medical failure. It was an interference. My beta blockers were supposed to keep the rate low. Something in that bitter tea was turning them off, forcing my heart to race, making me sick enough to die, but not sick enough to alert the emergency room doctors that something was wrong. They thought my body was complex. They were wrong. My body was just being sabotaged. I sat up slowly, feeling the weakness, but the terror was giving way to a cold, hard resolve. I had survived too many years working overtime, threading needles until midnight, enduring the damp heat of that factory, just to lose my life and my savings, because my own blood saw me as an inconvenience. Old habits die hard, and one of my oldest habits was fighting for what was mine. I looked at the closed door, then at the empty mug on the nightstand. I couldn't call the police. Not yet. If I called them now, they'd find no evidence. Just a paranoid old woman having an anxiety attack after hearing a vague financial discussion. Clara and David would claim I was confused, maybe even senile. They would call it a misunderstanding, and then they would be more careful. I needed proof. I needed to know exactly what they were doing to me. The next morning, Clara cooked me a small, bland oatmeal. I ate half, forcing myself to look sickly and weak. "That's good, Mom. Don't overdo it," she said, beaming. She then went out to the grocery store. David was in the garage, supposedly fixing a leaky faucet he'd never actually fix. I dragged myself out of bed. It was painful, but I had to move. I went to the kitchen. Clara had cleaned everything, even wiping down the inside of the cabinets. She had been taking control of my pantry lately, claiming certain foods were bad for my complex heart condition. I opened the cabinets, trying to remember where she kept the loose tea she used for my special blend. It wasn't with the normal herbs. My hands searched slowly, shaking a little from the weakness, but the adrenaline was rising. I found it in a deep corner of the topmost cabinet, behind the canned peaches I never opened. It was a large, plain plastic container, the kind used for protein powder or vitamins. Not tea. It was heavy. As I reached for it, David came through the back door. "Mom, what are you doing up? You need to rest." His voice was sharp, panicky. He rushed over and gently, but forcefully, steered me away from the cabinet. "I just wanted a cracker, dear. I'm hungry," I mumbled, playing the frail victim. He stood right in front of the cabinet, blocking it. He didn't even look guilty. He looked scared I would see what was behind him. "Clara will get you a cracker. Go rest, please. You nearly died 2 days ago. We have to be careful." I went back to my room, letting the weakness show, letting him believe he had won that small battle. But I watched him from the cracked door. The moment he thought I was asleep, David went straight to the cabinet, checked the container, and then quickly, almost violently, shoved it further back into the corner. It wasn't just Clara. David knew. That afternoon I started preparing. I had survived poverty and the humid Florida summer heat. I had survived a factory job that paid nothing and cost my body everything. I could survive this. I found a tiny, voice-activated digital recorder I had bought years ago for my local church meetings, hidden in my sewing box. It was small, no bigger than my thumb. I taped it securely underneath the cushions of my favorite armchair in the living room. Clara and David often sat there to check on me, whispering their plans right over the back of it. I needed an ally, someone outside the house, someone who wouldn't immediately call the police and ruin my chance to gather evidence, Someone who understood medicine, but wasn't part of the system that kept calling me complex. I thought of Ilara Jensen, 80-something years old, lived across the hall, sharp as a tack, and hadn't left her unit in 2 years except for the mail. She used to work at St. Mary's Hospital. I waited until Clara stepped out for another one of her frequent errands, probably checking on real estate listings, and David was in the shower. I put on my robe, grabbed my keys, and walked the 3 feet across the hallway. Ilara opened the door, her eyes immediately assessing my pale face. "Peggy, what on earth? I heard the ambulance the other night." I stepped inside her small, dark living room and locked the door behind me. I didn't say hello. I just whispered, "Ilara, they're killing me, and they want my condo." I told her everything, the specific pattern, the high heart rate only after Clara's food, the failure of the nitroglycerin, the doctor's confusion, and the overheard conversation about the will and the usual. Ilara listened without interrupting, just nodding slowly. She had seen too much human cruelty in her years as a hospice nurse to be shocked. When I finished, she didn't offer sympathy. She offered facts. "Complex case, they called it? Nonsense, dear. You're taking beta blockers to slow your heart down. They're feeding you something to speed it up. Caffeine, ephedrine, something like that. They're manufacturing an overdose of stimulation, making your heart work itself to death. But it looks like a natural cardiac failure." It was worse than I thought. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively pushing me toward the grave with every cup of tea. "If they know your medicines aren't working, they assume you have no defense," Ilara reasoned. "They took away your meds. We'll give you a weapon they can't see. Your nervous system." She took me to a chair and started explaining the diaphragmatic breathing again. The same thing the nurses had taught me. But Ilara was different. She wasn't clinical. She was fierce. "You panicked last time. We need to train your body to flip the switch," she said. 4 counts in, hold 4, and exhale slowly for 6 counts. Do it for 2 full minutes. If you can focus through the pain, you can drop that heart rate by 20 beats per minute. You need to buy yourself minutes, Peggy. That's all you have to do. I practiced for an hour in her house until my chest felt hollow, but my breathing was controlled. When I got back to my unit, I knew what I had to do. I had to continue playing the weak, failing mother. I had to let them think their poison was working. The next night, Clara brought the tea. I smiled weakly and took the mug. She watched. I took a sip, just enough to taste the bitterness and coat my mouth. And then, when she turned to fuss with my pillows, I poured the rest into a plastic plant pot near the window. I wiped the mug clean with a napkin and pretended to drink the last drops. As Clara left, I quickly moved the soil in the plant pot and scraped the tainted tea into a small, sterile glass vial I had found in my old sewing kit. It looked official. I spent the next 2 days acting frail. I barely left my bed. David had to lift me to help me use the bathroom. Clara was gleeful, her concern masking a ruthless triumph. The recorder beneath the armchair cushion captured at everything. I would drift close to the door, feigning a need for water, and hear them planning. "David, enough stalling." Clara's voice, cold and metallic, came through clearly on Wednesday night. "Dr. Thompson says she's critical. We need to finalize the power of attorney and the updated will before she enters the hospice stage. I want the lawyer here Friday. No exceptions." Friday, 48 hours. They were done waiting for my heart to fail. They were setting a deadline for my signature. That Thursday evening, Clara pushed too hard, convinced I was collapsing. She insisted I stand up and walk down the hall for exercise. I used her confidence against her. Halfway down the hall, I gasped, stumbled, and collapsed dramatically against the wall, clutching my chest. "My heart," I whispered weakly, letting my hand shake. "I think I'm going to pass out." Clara rushed to help, dragging me back to bed with surprising strength, her eyes shining with relief. She thought the end was minutes away. I lay there, feigning heavy sleep. Under the silk sheet, I began the breathing. 4 in, hold 4, 6 out, over and over, 2 full minutes. My heart rate slowed down. I stabilized myself while they stood over me, believing they had finally won. I had bought myself 48 hours, and I had a vial of their poison. Friday morning, hot and heavy, came fast. I was dressed in my best housecoat, lying in bed. The digital recorder was running beneath the armchair, waiting. David and Clara stood over me, impatience barely hidden behind their professional smiles. Mr. Harrison, the notary, waited by the door, holding the thick documents. "Just a few signatures, Mom, and you can rest easy," David murmured, handing me the pen. The document would transfer control of my home and finalize the insurance payout. As I reached for the pen, I felt the familiar, terrible spike. Clara had spiked my morning coffee. She knew I was too weak to resist now. My heart immediately started galloping, threatening to throw me into a lethal episode. I dropped the pen. I gripped the silk sheets, fighting the panic. 4, hold 4, 6 out. I focused on the air, on the numbers, forcing my parasympathetic nervous system to slam the emergency brake. I stabilized myself in absolute silence. David leaned in, whispering, his voice harsh and desperate. "Sign it, Mom. Now." I met his eyes. The fear was gone. I took one last, deep breath, stabilizing my pulse. I wasn't fragile anymore. I didn't reach for the pen again. Instead, I reached under my pillow and pulled out the small, sealed lab report Ilara had gotten for me late last night, confirming exactly what was in the vial. Next to it, I placed the digital recorder. "I won't be signing anything today, David," I said, my voice steady, clear and stronger than it had been in 6 months. "But you and Clara, you're going to be talking to the police, and they'll want to hear this recording." I lay there, staring at the closed door, the ugly words running on a loop in my head. We can't let her linger. David's agreement, the will, the condo. Everything I had worked for was now just a ticking clock, counting down my life. I tried to be rational. Maybe the medicine was making me paranoid. Maybe I misunderstood. But the pattern was too clear. Every time Clara brought that special tea, that horrible galloping started. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a physical fact. My beta blockers were supposed to keep the rate low. Something in that dark, sweet drink was fighting them. It was a war happening inside my 73-year-old chest, and they were the ones loading the bullets. The next evening, Clara brought the mug again. I watched her careful smile. It didn't reach her eyes. "Just rest, Mom. This will help settle your system," she chirped. I took the mug. It was warm, heavy. I took a sip. That bitter taste, under the honey, tasting like rust and something else I couldn't name. I finished it slowly while she sat there, watching me like a warden. I pretended to relax back into the pillows. When she finally left, closing the door softly, I lay there, waiting. 40 minutes later, it hit. Not the panic of before, but a pure physical shock. My heart rate climbed, pushing past 170, tightening my chest until breathing felt like sucking air through a damp sponge. I had followed every rule the doctors gave me. I called 911 immediately. I propped myself up. I took the nitro. Nothing worked. They thought my body was complex. They were wrong. My body was just being sabotaged. I knew I needed to find out what they were using, and I needed proof, because if I told the police now, Clara and David would claim I was senile, rambling about a misunderstanding. They would just be more careful next time. I had to move like I was made of chipped glass, slow and silent. The next morning, Clara was gone early for her errands. David was in the garage, tinkering with something loud that sounded very much like he wasn't fixing the leaky faucet he promised to fix last month. I dragged myself out of bed. It felt like moving a mountain. I was weak, but the fear was gone, replaced by a cold, steady fury. Old habits die hard, and mine was fighting for what was mine. I went to the kitchen. Clara had wiped everything clean. She had taken over my pantry, saying certain foods were bad for my complex condition. She always kept the stuff for her special tea somewhere hidden. I searched the lower cabinets first. Nothing but old spices. Then the middle ones. Nothing but canned goods. I had to reach high, into the top cabinet, where I never stored anything but emergency supplies and those heavy canned peaches. I reached up, hands shaking slightly. My fingers brushed something large, hard, and plastic, shoved way in the back corner. I pulled it out slowly. It was a large, generic plastic container, the kind used for protein powders or big vitamin supplements. It was heavy, too heavy for tea leaves. I fumbled with the lid. "Mom, what are you doing up?" David's voice, sharp and high, sliced through the quiet. He came bursting through the back door, rushing toward me. He didn't look guilty. He looked terrified that I had found the tub. He rushed over and gently, but forcefully, steered me away from the cabinet. "You need to rest. You shouldn't be straining yourself." "I just wanted a cracker, dear," I mumbled, playing the frail, dizzy victim. "I was hungry." He stood right in front of the cabinet, blocking it perfectly. He wouldn't let me get near it. "I'll get you a cracker. Go rest, please. You nearly died 2 days ago. We have to be careful." His concern sounded real, but his fear was bigger. Fear I would see what was behind him. I let him lead me back to my room, showing my weakness. I let him think he had won that small battle, but I watched him from the cracked door. The moment he thought I was asleep, David went straight back to the cabinet. He didn't even touch the cracker bag. He quickly shoved the large plastic container further back into the shadows. It wasn't just Clara and her cold ambition. David, my son, knew. The pain of that realization was worse than any spike in my heart rate. It wasn't a mistake. It was a plan, and he was part of it. They didn't see me as a mother. They saw me as a complex financial problem. I had to find an ally, someone who could see through the white coats and the medical mumbo-jumbo. I thought of Ilara Jensen across the hall, 80-something years old, hadn't left her unit in 2 years, but she was sharp as a tack. She used to be a certified hospice nurse at St. Mary's. She knew how people died, and she knew when it wasn't natural. I waited until Sunday afternoon. Clara and David were loudly watching a football game in the living room. Perfect timing. I put on my robe, grabbed my keys, and walked the 3 feet across the hallway. Ilara opened the door, her eyes narrowed, taking in my pale face immediately. "Peggy! What on earth? I heard the ambulance the other night. You look like death warmed over." I stepped inside her quiet, dark living room and locked the door behind me. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Ilara, they're killing me, and they want my condo." I told her everything, keeping my voice low. The pattern of the attacks only after Clara's tea, the failure of the nitroglycerin, the doctor's confusion, the plastic tub in the cabinet, and the whispered conversation about the will and not letting her linger. Ilara didn't look surprised. She just nodded slowly, like she was confirming something she already knew. She had seen too much human cruelty in her years as a nurse to be shocked by money. When I finished, she sat me down. Complex case, they called it. That's what they call it when they can't figure out the simplest trick, Alara said, her voice firm. You are taking beta blockers, dear. They are feeding you something highly stimulating. Caffeine concentrate, maybe ephedrine, the kind of things that are sold as weight loss supplements. They're manufacturing an overdose of stimulation that is designed to work against your pills, forcing your heart to race and burn itself out. It looks like a natural failure, especially when your system is already weak. She made it sound so simple, so horrifyingly obvious. They weren't waiting for me to get sick. They were making me sick. They were killing me slowly, with a mug of tea every night. If they know your medicines aren't working, they assume you have no defense, Alara reasoned, folding her hands in her lap. They took away your meds. We'll give you a weapon they can't see, your own nervous system. I started to cry, silent tears sliding down my temples. But what can I do? I can barely breathe. When it hits, the panic is too big. Alara took me to a sturdy wooden chair. The key isn't the pill, Peggy. It's the panic. When the heart races, the body panics, and the panic makes the heart race faster. You need to flip the switch. You already tried the breathing they taught you in the hospital, but you panicked, right? I nodded, swallowing hard. We need to train your body to slam the emergency brake. It's called controlled diaphragmatic breathing, but we're going to be precise about it. The doctor gave you the rules. I'll give you the power. She taught me the precise technique again, but this time, it was different. She wasn't clinical. She was drilling me. You have to control the air completely. Inhale through your nose for 4 counts. Let your belly rise. Hold that breath for 4 counts. Then, exhale slowly through pursed lips, like you're blowing out a candle a foot away. For 6 counts. You must focus completely on the numbers and the air. Nothing else. She made me practice, sitting right there in her quiet living room. I felt foolish, counting numbers like a child. But I focused hard. 4 in, hold 4, 6 out, over and over. Do this for 2 full minutes when you feel the spike start, Alara commanded. It's physics, Peggy. Focusing like this activates your parasympathetic system. It forces your heart to slow down. If you do it right, even with the poison in your system, you can drop that heart rate by at least 20 beats per minute. You need to buy yourself minutes. That's all you have to do to stay alive until you can get justice. I practiced for an hour until my chest felt hollow, but the breathing was controlled. I took my pulse before practice. 95 beats per minute, which was normal for me when resting. After 2 full minutes of the 4-4-6 breathing, I checked it again. It was 88. It worked even when I wasn't panicked. It gave me a weapon they couldn't see. When I got back to my unit, I knew I couldn't just survive the attacks. I had to use them. The next night, Clara brought the tea. I smiled weakly and took the mug. She sat there watching me like a hawk, waiting for me to drink down the next dose of poison. I took a large sip, enough to feel the bitter taste on my tongue. And then, as she turned to fuss with the window blinds, I quickly poured the rest into a plastic plant pot near the window. I pretended to drink the last drops and wiped the mug clean with a napkin. As soon as Clara left, I carefully scooped the soil in the pot, using a spoon from my sugar bowl. I scraped the tainted tea into a small, sterile glass vial I had kept in my old sewing kit. I sealed it tightly. This was Exhibit A. I spent the next 2 days acting frail, even more so than before. I barely left my bed. I let David lift me to help me to the bathroom. Clara was gleeful. She didn't hide her triumph well, calling it concern. She thought I was finally collapsing. Meanwhile, the voice-activated digital recorder I had hidden beneath the cushion of the armchair was running. I would drift near the bedroom door, pretending I needed water, and hear them whispering their plans. Wednesday night, the whispers turned hard. "David, enough stalling." Clara's voice was clear on the tape, cold and metallic. "Dr. Thompson says she's critical. We need to finalize the power of attorney and the updated will before she enters the hospice stage. I want the lawyer here Friday. No exceptions." Friday. 48 hours. They were done waiting for my heart to fail. They were setting a deadline for my signature. They wanted control of the $450,000. And they wanted it before I was too far gone to sign the papers or, worse, too lucid to change my will. David's voice was low and nervous, but the words were clear. "Yes, Clara. Friday morning." The pain of that moment was worse than any chest ache. I had spent my life raising that boy, teaching him right from wrong. You reap what you sow, I thought bitterly. But what had I sown to deserve this poison? That Thursday evening, Clara pushed too hard. She was convinced I was collapsing. She insisted I stand up and walk down the hall for exercise. I knew she wanted to see me struggle. I decided to give her a show. Halfway down the hall, I gasped loudly, stumbled, and collapsed dramatically against the wall, clutching my chest. "My heart?" I whispered weakly, letting my hand shake. "I think I'm going to pass out." Clara rushed to help, dragging me back to bed with surprising strength, her eyes shining with absolute relief. She thought the end was minutes away. She called David, who hovered anxiously. They stood over me, believing they had finally won. I lay there, feigning heavy, drugged sleep. Under the silk sheet, hidden from their sight, I began the breathing. 4 in, hold 4, 6 out, over and over, 2 full minutes. I focused only on the numbers, ignoring the pounding in my chest that Clara's effort had caused. My heart rate slowed down, stabilizing. I stayed still, breathing evenly and deeply, while they stood over me discussing how peaceful I looked. I had bought myself 48 hours, and I had a vial of their poison. I managed to sneak the vial over to Alara later that night, claiming I had to take out the trash. She had an old contact at a lab, and she was already waiting. The call came back late, just before midnight. Ilara's voice was tight with urgency. "Peggy, listen carefully. It wasn't just a high dose of caffeine. They mixed in a trace of a powerful, fast-acting vasoconstrictor, the kind that dramatically raises blood pressure and puts impossible strain on the heart. It's illegal for them to even possess. This confirms attempted murder, not just neglect. My hands were shaking, but not from fear this time. It was the confirmation. I had the lab report, which was the final objective proof I needed. They didn't just want me gone. They were violently accelerating my death. Friday morning dawned, hot and heavy. I was dressed in my best housecoat, lying in bed, the digital recorder running beneath the armchair in the living room, listening to their hushed, triumphant planning. David and Clara stood over me, slick and impatient. Mr. Harrison, the notary, waited discreetly by the door, holding the thick documents. "Just a few signatures, Mom, and you can rest easy," David murmured, leaning close, holding the pen out. The document would transfer the condo and finalize the insurance policy, the $450,000. As I reached for the pen, I felt the familiar, terrible spike. Clara had spiked my morning coffee. She knew I was too weak now. My heart immediately started galloping, threatening to throw me into a lethal episode. I dropped the pen. I gripped the silk sheets, fighting the panic that wanted to swallow me whole. 4, hold 4, 6 out. I focused on the air, on the precise count, forcing my nervous system to obey my command, not the poison's. I stabilized myself in absolute silence, my gaze locked on David. He leaned in, whispering, his voice harsh and desperate. "Sign it, Mom. Now." The fear was gone. I took one last, deep, stabilizing breath. I wasn't fragile anymore. I didn't reach for the pen again. Instead, I reached under my pillow and pulled out the small, sealed lab report Ilara had gotten for me, confirming exactly what was in the vial. Next to it, I placed the digital recorder, small as my thumb. "I won't be signing anything today, David," I said, my voice steady, clear and stronger than it had been in 6 months. "But you and Clara? You're going to be talking to the police, and they'll want to hear this recording. Before we continue, tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story will travel." Friday morning, hot and heavy, felt less like a deadline and more like a stage set for a terrible play. I was dressed in my best housecoat, sitting propped up in bed, recovering from the deliberate spike Clara had put into my morning coffee. David and Clara stood over me, slick and impatient, radiating a cold, greedy triumph. "Mr. Harrison." The notary waited discreetly near the armchair, holding the thick documents that represented my condo and the $450,000 insurance policy. David was leaning in, pressing the pen into my hand, when a sharp rap echoed from the front door of the unit. David shot a glare toward the hallway. "I told you, no interruptions, Harrison," David hissed, his voice tight with frustration at the delay. The bedroom door swung open. It wasn't Mr. Harrison. It was Ilara Jensen. She didn't look like an octogenarian who hadn't left her unit in 2 years. She looked like an executioner, dressed impeccably and holding a small, official-looking document. Flanking her were 2 uniformed officers from the Fort Lauderdale Police Department, their presence instantly changing the climate of the room. Clara gasped, gripping David's arm, but David just blustered, stepping away from the bed. "What is the meaning of this intrusion? You can't just—" "It means the meeting is adjourned, David," I stated, pushing myself fully upright against the pillows. The weakness was gone, replaced by a cold, steady adrenaline. I no longer looked like a fragile, dying woman. I looked like a 73-year-old taking her life back. "You thought my heart was failing naturally," I began, my voice clear and steady. "You were wrong. It was being sabotaged." I reached under my pillow and pulled out the small sealed lab report Ilara had secured. I handed it to the nearest officer, then pushed a copy toward the pale Mr. Harrison. "This analysis of my nightly healing tea confirms the presence of a potent vasoconstrictor mixed with a massive stimulant dose designed to directly counteract my prescribed beta blockers. You weren't helping me rest. You were deliberately forcing my heart into cardiac failure, trying to replicate a natural death." Clara tried to lunge forward, a panicked cry caught in her throat, but the second officer smoothly blocked her path. I continued, my gaze locked on my son, David. "You accelerated the timeline, David, hoping I wouldn't last the week to change the will. But while you were planning my funeral, I was collecting evidence." I pulled the voice-activated digital recorder from beneath the armchair cushion and placed it on the silk sheets next to me. I pressed the play button. Clara's chilling metallic voice filled the quiet room. "David, enough stalling. We need to finalize the power of attorney and the updated will before she enters the hospice stage. I want the lawyer here Friday. No exceptions." David's voice followed, low and nervous, confirming the appointment and the plan. The sound of their callous planning in the intimacy of my own bedroom made the officers stiffen. Mr. Harrison dropped the pen onto the documents. I then pulled out the sealed vial containing the tainted tea, placing it next to the recorder. "This is the poison you fed me, Clara. And this—" I picked up the lab report again, focusing on the numbers. "Proves you failed. My resting heart rate, which you wanted above 170. I could drop by at least 20 beats per minute simply by controlling my breathing. The weakness was a performance to buy me the time I needed to secure this proof." I looked at David, holding his gaze until he finally broke contact, staring at the floor. "You tried to force my signature on my death warrant today. Instead, you signed your own." As the officers moved to place David and Clara under arrest, David fought the tears, his face contorted in a final, desperate plea that broke the silence. He raised his hands, shaking them at me. "Mom, please, stop this. Think about what you're doing. I am your son. You're putting me in jail, ruining my life, the life you gave me. You will destroy your only family over this house and some money." I looked directly into David's tormented eyes, my own completely devoid of the maternal warmth I had spent my life nurturing. My voice was quiet, firm, and colder than the air conditioning. The son I raised would never have poisoned his mother for an insurance payout. I sold my entire youth, threading needles in a factory, just to own this one small corner of the world. David, you tried to steal it for $450,000 by canceling out my life-saving medicine. You stopped being my son the moment you chose the money over my life. The lead officer snapped the handcuffs onto David's wrists. David tried to pull away, still muttering denials, but the officer's grip was firm. "David Peterson, Clara Peterson, you are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, and elder abuse." Clara let out a choked cry as the cuffs were placed on her. They were escorted out through the front door, their final moments in my home spent in humiliation and silence. Mr. Harrison, still shaken, immediately suspended and annulled the power of attorney documents, leaving only the sound of his heavy stamp echoing in the sudden silence of the unit. David and Clara's trial was swift and brutal, driven by the objective horror of the lab reports and the raw proof of the audio recording. David was sentenced to 14 years of reclusion in a federal penitentiary for attempted murder and elder abuse. Clara, deemed the ruthless mastermind, received 17 years. David lost his job and his professional license to sell insurance, a field he had often used to scope out potential victims. Both were ordered to pay $750,000 in restitution for emotional and medical damages. The financial desperation that had driven their crime became their absolute ruin. Every small investment they had was seized, every account frozen. The community of Fort Lauderdale, where they had lived for years, was horrified by the betrayal, and all remaining family members, including cousins and aunts, completely cut off contact. David and Clara now served their time, isolated and disgraced, having lost everything they gambled my life for. In the 2 years following the trial, I underwent a quiet, profound renaissance. I was now 75 years old, and my life was no longer defined by weakness. I used the very knowledge Alara taught me to manage my chronic heart condition completely. My energy returned, and my resting heart rate stabilized permanently, back to a healthy 85 beats per minute, allowing me to reduce my dependence on daily beta blockers by over 50%. I lost nearly 30 pounds and regained the clarity and strength I had lost during the years of poisoning. I didn't just survive. I built something beautiful on the ruins of their betrayal. I took the $450,000 they had coveted and, along with the help of Alara, established the Second Wind Foundation. It wasn't a formal, large charity, but a small, focused community group dedicated to teaching elderly victims of abuse and neglect the principles of self-regulation and defense. The small, sunny condo unit David had intended to sell was converted into the Foundation's first wellness center. I now hold weekly, informal workshops teaching the precise 4-4-6 diaphragmatic breathing technique. I teach them that 2 full minutes of focused breathing is a more potent tool against panic and cardiac stress than any pill alone. I teach over 60 seniors across my local community how to identify silent manipulation and use their own nervous systems as their first line of defense. I found a deeper, truer family in the community I saved, spending my days surrounded by women who understood that surviving wasn't enough. We had to flourish. Sometimes when I am leading a group, teaching the technique, I think of David and Clara, locked away, defined forever by their greed. They wanted to bury me for the money. But the truth is, what was meant to be my poison became my purpose. I didn't just survive their attempt on my life. I built a sanctuary on its ruins. The revenge most complete is the one you achieve simply by breathing deliberately, quietly, and living the life they'd tried to take. And if you stayed with me until the end, leave a comment letting me know what you thought of the story and what kinds of stories you'd like to read more of. Thank you so much for being here. See you in the next emotional story.